Good evening. Welcome to SCI-Arc. I'm Marcelo Espina. I'm the coordinator of the ESTM post-professional program at SCI-Arc, and I'm here to introduce Keller Easterling. If there is a true significance to the word pleasure, it is in fact a real pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Keller Easterling to SCI-Arc. For whatever it's worth, this is the first time I have the pleasure to introduce somebody twice, and so I'm happy that that happens to be Keller. According to Wikipedia, Keller Easterling is a contemporary writer working on the issues of urbanism, architecture, and organization in relation to the phenomena commonly defined as globalization. According to her bio, she's an architect, urbanist, and writer from New York City. She's also a full professor at the School of Architecture at Yale University. I'm not going to go into all the details, but she has published numerous books, including Enduring Innocence, Global Architecture and Its Political Masquerades. One of the first books, Organization Space, Landscapes, Highways, and Houses in America. And there is a forthcoming book, which I think the lecture probably will shed some light into, which is called, I'm going to see if I get this right, Extrastatecraft, that examines global infrastructure networks as a medium of polity. So now, after having established these basic facts, I feel my introduction should come primarily as a warning. For those of you who think very strongly, almost dogmatically, about the discipline of architecture and what the discipline of architecture is, and it should be, especially those of you who even think of particular canonic buildings, alignments, and families throughout history, from Renaissance through Baroque, from modernism to postmodernism and beyond, the cultural and theoretical implications of Keller Easterling's writings will make you pause, maybe perplex you even. The inquisitiveness of the research, the particularity of the gathered information, the quantity of the detailed facts, as well as their distinct nature and the regions across the world where these emanate from, it all must tell you something about the unorthodox character of both, the difficult content our speaker is trying to convey, but also, and maybe more importantly, the complexity of the speaker itself, including her proclivity for political activism as slippery descent, rather than wholehearted resistance, and even more importantly, her silent but implicit disdain of known canons, whether disciplinary or otherwise, ranging from remarks on economic policy, consequences of changing social orders, new geopolitical systems, emerging economies, and their implications for both national identities and global labor. Keller's meticulously crafted narratives and its precise delivery, and I make this a point, precise delivery, are as important as the content of her writing itself. With a background in playwriting, Keller's work might be one of the most innovative and correspondingly difficult to situate within current scholarly research and contemporary discourse. So then, what's the genre of Keller Easterling's work? Is it drama? Is it fiction? Is it theory, history, urbanism? Is it design? I, for one, do not claim to have an answer for that. Furthermore, I'd like to suggest to all of you, disciplinary fanatics or otherwise, that trying to find an early answer to these questions might be falling into the very categorical trap that, supported by a disciplinary orthodoxy, prevents us in the first place from understanding the true significance and contemporary relevance of Keller's work. So please welcome me and joining Keller Easterling.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Marcelo. Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just thought I'd say something simple this evening. If we speed through images of the space in which we're swimming, sort of retinal afterglows of a soupy mix of details and formulas, repeatable formulas that make most of the space in the world, and buildings, that we typically think of, that we're trained to make as singularly crafted enclosures, geometric, formal objects. we find are often reproducible products, spatial products that proliferate globally. We're used to it now. You know, this is the familiar confetti of colored boxes that are nestled in black asphalt or bright green grass. And now, not only buildings, but also entire cities have become mobile, monetized formulas, monetized technologies, almost infrastructural technologies. Not like an infrastructure like pipes and wires that are hidden underground, but a cartoon of abstract technical logics that's kind of pressing into view, not hidden, right, but really pressing into view. And the typical urban formulas that you find replicate Shenzhen and Dubai, anywhere around the world, with the sort of drumbeat of generic skyscrapers. So these infrastructural technologies are then, you know, they form not only the urban substructure, but the urban structure itself. I never thought I'd be one of those architects who has to mention Victor Hugo. You know, and I only mention him now to kind of turn the tables on the familiar argument about the death of architecture. You remember that in Notre Dame de Paris, Hugo famously observes that architecture like that of the cathedral was a sort of registration of human thought. The cathedral was like a giant, quote, giant with 1,000 heads and 1,000 arms that fixed all this floating symbolism in eternal, visible, palpable form. But he predicted, as you know, we're so tired of this, we've been hand-wringing over this for so long, that the printed word of Gutenberg's press would usurp the architectural giant as the vessel of cultural imagination. It would steal all of its supernatural power. This would kill that, the book would kill the edifice. And you might assume that if we look at contemporary architecture, contemporary evidence of urban space, doesn't it only just confirm Hugo's assertion about the death of architecture? We don't build cities by accumulating singular masterpiece buildings. The discipline of architecture is responsible for a trickle of the world's spaces, while, you know, a fire hose blasts out the rest. Architecture is making very important, very beautiful stones in the water, but the world is making this water. But I want to turn the tables on the argument. I want to argue the exact opposite. I want to argue that if architecture in that fable was supposedly killed by the book, if that's the case, then it's reincarnated as something much more powerful still, as information itself. I want to argue that the mystifying giant, the powerful giant with 1,000 arms, 1,000 heads, is alive again in this explosive growth, this sort of fluid, material, what we might call matrix space of global infrastructure. And the information is not information in a text or code on a digital device. It's information that's inscribed in activity, invisible, but powerful activity that determines how objects and contents will be organized and circulated. It's information that's not carried on wires or microwaves, but space, where space is the carrier of a non-textual cultural imaginary in a totemic marketplace. And the spatial technologies of this matrix space that have the power and the currency of not text, but software. You know, they're an operating system for shaping the city, you know, much, much more powerful. And it's pretty clear to me that some of the most radical changes in the globalizing world are being written, you know, not in the language of law and diplomacy, but rather in the language of architecture and urbanism, in the spatial technologies of infrastructure, in the language of this kind of operating system. And this matrix space is generating de facto forms of polity faster than even quasi-official forms of governance can legislate it. So the world's spatial products orchestrate all kinds of undeclared activities that are often capable of outpacing law. They're really massive global infrastructure systems administered by public and by private players, driven by profound irrationality. It's not a rational world that's run by rational policy. It's a crazy world. And it forms a kind of extrastatecraft that's wilder than any of our familiar leviathans. What I mean by extrastatecraft is not something that's outside of the state, but something that's found a new partnership with the state, that the state uses as another proxy or partner or camouflage. Now, one thing that's very clear is that choosing to make the stone in the water, the sort of object form, is already a beautiful, powerful, completely reasonable, artistic choice. Politically significant artistic choice. There's no question about that. But the thing that I end up wondering about is what if the water is also an artistic curiosity? This sort of mysterious, pervasive, hyperbolic but seemingly remote controlled phenomenon, this flow of information that's carried in activity in space. I mean, right now, it's controlled by quants and 28-year-old McKinsey consultants and yes men from the World Bank. It's discussed in technical terms of informatics and economics, and in those technical terms, space is kind of a byproduct, however durable or however ecstatically elaborate it is. It's just considered a byproduct. So I can't help but ask, what if our spatial training gives us insight into the way it works, into the way the operating system works? And artistically, what if this matrix space tutors nothing less than an additional, not a replacement, but an additional approach to form making that doesn't challenge or duel with object form, but rather partners with it, propels it, gives it yet more power? What if this matrix space tutors also an alternative approach to political arts? What if infrastructure space is not, the fairy story monster to be opposed, but a surrounding magic? And what if some of the enigmas of this space don't distance it from, but rather return it to the purview of art? It's pretty clear that the political world could use from us, use from somebody besides the quants and McKinsey consultants, some in addition to object form making in another register, another part of speech, form making in another gear, what we might call active form, an active form that propels object form. Not a digital, but a spatial software within which architecture is information, an updating platform of spatial variables, a form for handling forms. So matrix space is like a global operating system with the protocols that organize and sequence urbanity. Matrix space is active, it's doing something. When it directs the routines of space and makes some things possible and some things impossible. And in some ways we already know what it is, but we're pretty under-rehearsed in thinking about it. So before plunging into evidence, which is usually what I lecture about, I thought it would be nice to just sort of have a short contemplation on what that might mean to actually be thinking about something called active form. How would you practically begin to exercise that additional faculty in addition to the one we know? I mean, architecture offers, among many other things, an exquisite aesthetic training in the connoisseurship of object, profile, outline. So if we were someone to create something like active form, seemingly oxymoronic active form, we would rely on what we are best trained to create, an object. designed to represent action or dynamic process, or we would think action or activity would be equated with program, or we would confuse it with movement or kineticism. We would try to taxonomize or codify it. We would want to know that. But how do you assess activity or information exchange in the static arrangement of some kind of familiar organization like this, of a highway system or an electrical grid or a suburb? We just don't treat spaces or urban organizations as actors. We treat them as collections of objects and volumes. Agencies only assign, if it's assigned at all, it's assigned to the moving cars or the inhabitants or the electrical current or something like that. So we're less accustomed to the idea that space, rather than code or text, can be a carrier of information, and unless it's coded with sensors or information technologies. But what I want to argue is that space, however static, possesses agency that resides in relationship and relative position. Space itself is the carrier of information. It doesn't have to be coded with sensors. As Gregory Basin would say, a man, a tree, and an axe is an information system. If we think of the way, this is hard for us, but if we think of the way in which a computer scientist would never try to represent the internet, but would author all kinds of active forms like softwares or multipliers that ride the internet, they design a form for handling forms. Or a forester wouldn't try to wire every bird to every tree. They would send in an agent that would inflect ecologies over time. Or an entrepreneur doesn't design only the product, but its passage through a market. So maybe the idea isn't really all that unfamiliar. If you look at this, which is a sort of technology of stick construction, with a script about home ownership or Cape Cod or early American houses. But if you look at it, the overwhelming activity is an agricultural process of making houses. So the organization is saying something different from what it's doing, but beyond the activity of human beings within it, the arrangement itself is rendering something significant and others insignificant. It's doing something. For instance, here it's impossible to build an individual house that's different from all the others. There's a kind of operating system there. There's a kind of non-digital spatial software that's doing something in that suburban field, and changes in that field constitute information. If you think about DARPANET, first scripted as a stealth network for the military, it becomes the Internet Commons. Or you think of Facebook, a software scripted for social networking that possesses some other undeclared property that allows it to unfold in the Arab Spring as an instrument of dissent. Or that limited access highway with stories about freedom and nonstop movement. It possesses some kind of organizational logic that actually promotes congestion. So in all those cases, information resides in some undeclared activity, some capacity that's immanent in the arrangement and the organization. It doesn't have to be an event that's named, like this, in this case, the ball doesn't have to roll down the hill to possess in its geometry and in its relative position that kind of latent capacity to do so. So I get excited about all these examples because in it, the spatial relationships and activities are something you can get between your hands, and because the world often spins around the undeclared. So we can rush into this landscape and redesign a single one of those houses with the objects forms that we are trained to make. But we're often bewildered by the way in which our object form continues to be outwitted by some larger process that's controlled elsewhere. So what if we, in relation to this site, choose a different site in the same site? Designing a kind of multiplier or a contagion that uses the organization as a carrier that will replicate within many houses. So we're changing the landscape, not unlike the elevator changed urban morphology. The elevator was a germ that completely change the way cities look. So if we try out some other faders or toggles of this spatial software, it's obvious that we could send in a multiplier. We could send in a germ into the repetitive populations of matrix space. But the designer of a kind of software of active forms is not designing the field in its entirety, but is designing something like a delta, the means by which the field changes. So not only the shape and contour of a game piece, but how the game piece plays. Spatial softwares design not just the object, but also maybe the valve, the governor, the switch that directs a flow of multiple objects. It's maybe an updating platform for shaping a stream of changes in an environment. So one can extend the power of object form that we know so much about. The valve, the switch, the governor might even be remote controlled or in a functional expression for space, something like a cosine X for space. We could place together different kinds of interdependent variables that will unfold over time. We can make forms for handling forms. We know something about the patterns of connectivity, the network topology in an organization. Topology is originally an urban problem of moving between different parts of a city. We know about disposition, the disposition of that wiring or that topology as something that's a hub and spoke, a linear, an all-channel, a serial, a parallel network. So we're making active form when without changing any of the objects, we're changing the way the objects are wired together and changing their relationship dials up different consequences. We even know something about the political temperament of these topologies. My favorite example one of my favorite examples of a spatial software is strangely Savannah, an 18th century American city. And Oglethorpe didn't design that as a single thing. He didn't design it as a plat, you could image the whole city all at once. He designed it as a software, as a kind of growth protocol, as a set of interdependencies. So the town would grow by wards, and each of those wards would have a percentage of public and private space in it. And every time you got a ward, you also got, this is sort of washed out, but you also got a agricultural space beyond. So it was an active form. It was a form for handling forms. It produced no single object. You didn't know the shape of the town's outline, but you had an explicit direction, an explicit protocol for how the town would grow, a kind of measured spatial instruction. So this approach, this sort of artistic habit of mind is a non-modern proposition, right? It's not a binary challenge to object form. It's not a succession. It's not a killing of the father. It's not a Manichaean struggle. It's not an either-or choice. What's offered is a means by which architects might extend the reach of what we do, give special powers to what we do, a way of maybe shaping ongoing, maybe even sneakier spatial consequences in this complex global matrix space. And I'll say as we go on that we can maybe enhance the aesthetic training we have for making the object with almost something like the aesthetic training one would receive for performance. Forms that have time-release powers, remote controls, cascading effects. So it's not a challenge to the magic we already do very well, but something that it releases us into an extended territory. But if we plunge back into evidence, if we take this contemplation back into a world of all of the explosive changes that are being written in the language of matrix space, we could say, I can tell you that first the world does have a dominant software for space. Right now, it's mostly called the free zone. It's an infrastructural technology that now the world uses to make cities. The promotional videos are always the same. There's a zoom from outer space that locates a globe, and the graphics indicating flight times demonstrate that that place is at the center of the Earth, and then there's a deep kind of movie trailer voice that lists all the requisite features. And there's, you know, stirring John Williams music, bonanza music that accompanies this swoop through cartoon skylines and resorts and suburbs and sun flares. And the video typically describes what is now, you know, the most contagious world city paradigm, the free zone. And no one really knows why we're using it. It's a relatively dumb enclave form that produces suboptimal economic results, but the reason why we're using it is because we've been using it, and because the world's gotten addicted to a kind of incentivized urbanism that it offers. As if it were a software, it would be something like MS-DOS, but it's what we've got, it's what we use. And the wild mutations of this free zone form over the last 30 years also make it look insanely penetrable. It has ancient roots in the pirate enclaves of free ports and Easterlings. My people were original free trade crooks. But the zone mutated from an early 20th century warehouse compound for storing custom free trade to a mid-century UN-promoted export processing zone. It was a formula for jump-starting the economies of developing countries. But it operates under authorities independent from the domestic laws of the host country. The zone typically offers tax holidays, cheap labor, streamlined customs, deregulation of laws about labor and environment. And while it remained backstage, the zone, once it was adopted by China as an experiment in the late 70s, then began to grow exponentially all over the world. And every program or business, residential, cultural resort wanted to locate in the zone. Why not? You know, to enjoy its kind of lubricated political quarantine. So the zone, you know, has now kind of swallowed the city whole. The zone now takes center stage. It is the germ of a city building epidemic that produces all the glittering mimics of Dubai and Singapore and Hong Kong all around the world. It used to look like this, right? And now, or this, and now it looks like that, and that, and that. And while in the 1960s there were a handful of zones in the world, today there are thousands, some measured in hectares, some measured in square kilometers. The zone is the nexus of every global technology. It's the one-stop shop, the clean slate entry into the economy of a foreign country. It's the site of headquartering for almost every global player. And it's now also kind of self-perpetuating agent of extrastate territory. It was created as an instrument of economic liberalism, but the zone now trades in a kind of extra-state bureaucracy that's sometimes even more complex, more bureaucratic. This is, for instance, a trademarked form of urbanism called Technopark in Skolkovo, outside of Moscow. In its sweatshops and dormitories, it's still, you know, even though it's somehow evolved, it's still the hidden site of pretty grisly labor abuse. Zones maintain a kind of autonomous control over a closed loop of circumstances. So it's a kind of isomorphic disposition, a kind of what I've sometimes called a kind of special stupidity that permits no contradiction. It's a kind of naturalized form of lawlessness. And surpassing irony, now major cities, even national capitals, want to have their own zone doppelganger, which their own kind of zone pirate that they can use as proxy and brand and camouflage. You're looking at new Songdo city, which is a kind of double of Seoul in the Incheon Free Trade Zone. What the developer Stanley Gale has called a city in a box. He wants to build more. It's based on New York and Venice and Sydney, so there's there's every program in the world, but then there's also a Central Park, a Canal Street, a World Trade Center, so on. Or Astana, which is the newly minted capital of Kazakhstan as free trade zone. So this is now the national capital, which is supposed to be, presumably the center of national law, is building a capital as zone. And this is part of President Nazarbayev's new, Paleo-Genghis competition with Dubai. So again, while created to be apolitical, the zone is in the crosshairs of global politics. And this also become a kind of strange form of intentional community. While for all its intentions to be a tool of economic and logistical rationalization, it's become a perfect crucible of irrationality, run with the silly patois of quality management and management ease, with palaces and resorts where petrodollars can get away to relax. So how do we look at something like this? How do we look at this phenomenon? Obviously, it's evidence that the world, that the politics of the world are being written in a language of architecture and urbanism. That's clear. But we've been trained to think about. But what do we do with this? We could build another skyscraper in this zone, and that would be very important work. That would be important. Where there'd be all kinds of important experiments that could be done by building a single building within a zone. But again, if you have another artistic curiosity, there are also several active forms that you might deploy. For one thing, the zone is already a very highly contagious multiplier. So it can be used as a carrier of a new program, new technology, a new vehicle, a new protocol. Will there be anything in Masdar city that is contagious? Who knows? Also, given the zone's ambition to be a city, given the way that it's mutated over the last 40 years, it seems penetrable. It maybe also already carries with it the antidote, the genetics of its own antidote. When I was recently asked to give a talk at the World Free Zone Convention, and I said, "Are you sure, that you really want me to talk about?" And I confessed already that I was a sort of Trojan horse, but I went there and I thought, why not just lie a little bit? And so I predicted that the next smartest zone entrepreneur would simply ask, why enclave? Why not map some of the same infrastructures and incentives onto the city? So we know why that would work. We know that that's changing the wiring, that's changing the topology, or why that would be significant. So that one could map some of the special infrastructures not onto ex-urban enclaves outside of Nairobi or Guadalajara or Moscow or Quito, but in the city itself. And I think there is some spatial entrepreneur that's going to discover, for instance, that greater populations in those cities generate juicier profits, overwhelm security risks, and more importantly, return benefits to the domestic economy more directly. It's elementary urbanism for us, but I want to say there's a significant difference between going someplace and doing a master plan for it as a singular object and positioning a change that might be carried in a population of zones. How does one do that? An alteration that's a multiplier in a population. So an architecture career that makes this idea contagious would not be designing one thing, but making a calculated design aimed at a population of things. But let's go to another site. We can also look at perhaps the next huge global spatial infrastructural change in your lifetime by dropping down into East Africa. We could look at Kenya, for instance, to sample some of the spatial effects of broadband mobile telephony. East Africa is an interesting place to look at because it's the last place on Earth to receive international fiber optic submarine cable. But right now, it's one of those places that's poised to experience some of the most explosive telecommunications growth. So, just, oops, it's really washed out. But the story is that cable finally arrives in East Africa. East Africa used to look like this. The cable was bypassing it. Now it looks like this. There's, 3 cables landed in Mombasa, and if we're looking at Kenya. And while the world had, in 2000, the world had 750 million cell phone subscribers. Now there's over 5.6 billion, and over 3/4 of those are in the developing world. The mobile phone is the world's largest shared platform, according to the World Bank. It's the thing. It's the one. It's not a universal, but it's one of those things that we share. And broadband infrastructure is now touted as a resource that's as important as water. The fixed. It's really washed out. The fixed linear fiber that's buried in the ground. Territorializes almost like a railroad or a highway, while the cell phone is more atomized. It territorializes in a different place, and there's all kinds of choke points and switches anywhere in between and all along that line. And probably as urbanists, any urbanist worth their salt would know why it matters, would know how a highway or a railroad territorializes. But we're probably under-rehearsed in the spatial consequences of broadband and mobile telephony because it's invisible sometimes, even though in many ways it's really clear that the cell phone is the new elevator, right? It's going to have the same kind of spatial power as an elevator. The broadband and mobile telephony are changing the very terms of city, village, road, school, market. I mean, the cliched examples like the farmer doesn't have to take his peas to market. He can look on his cell phone and find out whether he's getting the right price and that kind of thing. So everything is changing as a result. And even Kenya, there's plenty of economists and McKinseyites and bankers on the ground there. And the development expertise is being spoken in the languages of business, of technology, of informatics, of economics, and all these guys are trying to predict the impact of broadband on what they call development 2.0. There's also plenty of new entrepreneurs, like the entrepreneurs of Mpesa. They're writing software for billions of cell phones. Mpesa, as you know, is the new way of banking and exchanging money, and started in Kenya, but now spread all over the world almost instantly. The entrepreneurs know how to use the cell phone as a multiplier, as a carrier of all kinds of relationships that have enormous spatial consequence. But the spatial consequence is treated as a kind of accidental byproduct of these softwares. No one's deliberately writing the protocols that start with space and study the interdependencies between ICT infrastructure and space in Urbanism 2.0, even though it will be a major determining factor of population concentrations, of the accessibility, resilience of the broadband network. These are socio-technical networks. They don't just exist. They are shaped by the way that they're used. And strangely, the only thing that's on offer as something like a spatial software is the outmoded zone. That's the MS-DOS, the kind of dull button, is offered. Even as the capacities of broadband make this form even more obsolete. Kenya is flush with broadband and mobile telephony now that, as we would say, changes the terms of everything, but it's going for this. It's going for the Kanza techno city. Or Lapset is also treated as a good idea. Lapset is a transportation corridor between Lamu and Juba in South Sudan, capital South Sudan. And it will be a linear corridor studded with zones and resorts, and it will carry oil to the coast. So there it is. Well, Kenya is poised to finally harness a technology that might provide intelligent forms of rural development, preserve wilderness, wildlife, tourism, have remote schooling, and it's kind of adopting an old and potentially really dangerous development formula around resource extraction. So just as Oglethorpe speculated about a kind of Savannah formula that would place variables in interdependent relationships, what would be the kinds of variables one would use to set up interdependencies, offsets, bargains that are spatial variables? Offsets are now a large part of what I was calling extrastatecraft, but again, no one's making those variables, those offsets and bargains in spatial terms. Well, we could think of other places in the world that could use our ability to make active form or forms for handling forms, this form in another gear. Sometimes what's needed is not a development machine that makes more object form, but rather the ability to put that machine into reverse. So for instance, in the Amazon forest or in McMansion's suburbia, and it's considered entirely rational, even though it's really completely irrational, to leave it to the economists who are running the carbon market, or to the quants or the financial industry who link properties in all kinds of abstract relationships, even though the result is kind of untraceable volatility, even while the physical effects on the ground are very durable. But what if we use multipliers, remotes, governors, craft interdependencies between properties in space, where the risks and rewards are not so untraceable, are not are not just sort of going through Swiss banks? What if they're visible and tangible, where all the values associated with property are in play? How would you make something like a subtraction protocol, almost like a Savannah in reverse, like a reverse game of Go, where what's favored is not walls but clearings? A subtraction protocol that kind of ratchets and links properties, relieves failed properties, concentrating densities in different ways, creating a kind of cosine X of interdependent variables. So subtraction protocol might play out through an accumulation of simple moves, like densifying properties that are linked to properties where development is deleted, increase taxes and revenues, relieve toxic sites, and new sites in turn generate shared revenues. We're even, while we attach, we use housing starts as an economic indicator, we might even think of using deconstruction, the removal of housing, as a new form of economy and jobs. A subtraction protocol might be appropriate in many parts of the world where, for instance, there's sprawling overdevelopment, or distended or failed markets, or where development confronts environmental issues, where it would be wise to retreat from exhausted land or floodplains, or where there are special preserves of land. And it might also offer some less violent tools of acquisition or tools against disenfranchisement in informal settlement. So finally, having looked at all this in the kind of whirlwind tour, I want to say a few words about the political arts, about an extension of our political arts as well. The things that make matrix space so powerful, these multipliers, whether they're zones or cell phones or spatial products, or it's irrational fictions, or it's undeclared but consequential activities, are maybe also the very things that return it to the purview of spatial arts. These attributes are certainly the things that make matrix space immune to the white hat, immune to the righteous declarations and prescriptions. So this matrix space, just as it maybe responds to form making in another register, this kind of active forms that operate more like a software, so it also responds to an enhanced repertoire for activism. Not righteousness in this case, but something more like discrepancy is the most instrumental marker. The discrepancy between content and activity, or between what an organization is saying and what it's doing. It's the undeclared agency that's so powerful, that makes the kind of matrix space we've been looking at, that makes it kind of the secret weapon of some of the most powerful people on earth. But if it's harnessed for alternative political goals, the same attributes that empower matrix space might not only empower but also amplify new political arts of extrastatecraft. It's clear that some forms of political activism demand declaration, demand the white hat, strongly held, forthright beliefs, galvanize a fight for some kind of solidarity or decency or justice. People stand together to give it a name. But righteousness is often also fooled by the sneaky way the world works sometimes. And the real power players that are using undeclared activities of space, because it lets them wander away from the bullseye. And often what we find is not the sort of epic binary tale of enemies and innocents, the righteous and the unrighteous fighting together. That's not what turns the story, right? It's a little epidemic of rumor or duplicity that finally captures the world's attention, that finally turns things. And even the idea that this is a sort of proper realm of political negotiation acts as the perfect camouflage for this kind of more elusive behavior, for the secret weapons. When you look at some of the spaces that I look at, it's very clear that there are no white hats. It's not a David and Goliath story, or if it is, Goliath comes dressed as David quite frequently. And dissent is then often left sort of shaking its fist at an effigy. It shows up at the barricades for the proper political moment, and the real change is happening over your shoulder. And sometimes only allowing for those kind of proper, righteous, pure political techniques forecloses on the very dissensus that we sometimes want to instigate. So what I've been thinking about is, just as the way in which some of the most powerful people on earth have a proxy or a camouflage or a pirate, I'm trying to serve as that kind of unwelcome, maybe even unwitting partner to the more pure or more orthodox forms of activism, with a kind of alternative set of techniques to be sure that the right guys win. So don't mistake this for equivocation or collusion, but it's also not a position for the pure or the faint of heart, since it might involve swimming in some of the same waters with all the other shills and butlers and confidence men in the world. But I've been thinking for a long time about some techniques that are less self-congratulatory, less automatically oppositional, but potentially more effective and sneakier. Like, for instance, techniques like gifts, not tense binaries, right, but gifts, like the panda, or exaggerated compliance, or gossip, or rumors, or so on. The panda or the award is a sweet, arm-twisting gift, like China giving Taiwan 2 pandas whose names, when translated, mean unity, or In Domination on the Arts of Resistance, James T. Scott provides a great example of exaggerated compliance. It's in a portion of Milan Kundra's The Joke, and you know, the story is about prisoners, and the prisoners at one point are running it. They have to run a foot race against the guards, and they know that they have to lose against the guards, and so they decide that they'll all run very slowly in this very exaggerated pantomime of losing. And they'll run slowly while the guards are sprinting. But their compliance brings them together in an act of defiance. It doesn't really diminish their energies with competition, with fighting. It's different from collusion, right? Though this exaggerated compliance, because it can disarm and also deliver independence from authority. Misdirections, distractions, think of hustlers or confidence men or Chauncey Gardner and being there. That can kind of lull, redirect some of the most intractable political situations. Or comedy that distracts and diffuses tension, but it also destabilizes some of the most self-satisfied critique as well as the kind of the most hollow consensus. So this extended repertoire of form making that's more elusive and powerful that we've been talking about, the multipliers, the remotes, the topologies, the subtraction, could also then serve techniques of a political art. Powers already present in these networks, and it's not necessarily an obstacle, but a means to amplify change. So in some ways, in this case, one's thinking about, if it's a David and Goliath story, is thinking about a sort of sneakier David that would never go to the trouble of killing Goliath, but would use him to do a lot of work, and use his size to do work, to amplify some kind of alteration. A remote control allows another one that I would talk about is the remote control, which would allow you to indirectly influence circumstances without being detected. Or rumor and gossip, that's another instructive multiplier. Gossip, rumor, hoax, they're all tools for destabilizing power, and they are themselves like the multipliers we've been talking about. For instance, the rumor that, that Obama wasn't born in the US, or that the rumor that Obama was a Muslim is beautifully crafted. It's perfect because it's very easy to refute. It has nothing to do with content. It's perfect because it is so easy to refute, and because it's so easy to refute, it's repeated twice as much to spread the rumor and then, to refute it. So it's not about the content of the story, but about the way it behaves. It's about the active form that has to be designed. In Advanced Studio a few years ago, we presented in reviews, and it was also in an exhibition at Storefront, something called Some Two Stories, which was a mixture of fact and fiction. The design ideas were already at work spreading a rumor that the world had changed. So there were things that were sort of almost true. We thought we would just spread that rumor. So a project that I worked on demonstrated different ways in which the floor is the most important architectural surface. And if you believe that, we also designed HighSpeed Rail for the desert that traveled to Las Vegas. Actually, was surprised to find after designing this that it already existed. I'll leave you to guess which is the real and which is the fake renderings. So we tried to rehearse in that work kind of entrepreneurialism. Usually an artist or an architect or an activist wishes to offer some kind of perfect thing, something that reveals their soul, that alters the world in a permanently useful or memorable masterpiece. for reform. But entrepreneurs want the exact opposite, right? They wonder what the other person wants and how to get them to change their mind about what they want over and over and over again, to supersede, refresh, reverse the products and plans that they had originally introduced. So they're not making the revolution, they're constantly revolutionizing. And in school, we get a lot of rehearsal. Marcelo told you that I was trained in theater, but if architecture school were like drama school, we get a lot of rehearsal in the class where you learn to do the masterpiece soliloquy. You know, you learn to do Hamlet's soliloquy. We don't get a lot of rehearsal in the improvisation class. We don't get the improvisation class. We don't get to rehearse in some ways our ability to be reactive to the world's markets and politics. So that studio and ones that I'm working on now are aimed at rehearsing those things by delivering news at different moments in the course of the studio that change conditions, that allow us to sort of rehearse our agility. And all these techniques are, again, offering not a kind of tense binary resistance, but maybe something that releases us into a new territory. They're not, again, setting up anything but an enhancement of the object form that we are already so good at doing. And while it's the irrationality and the invisibility of the discrepancy that make up this matrix space, this secret weapon of the most powerful, I just want to be able to say that two can play at this game. So that when we pan back over this matrix space, maybe we see nothing but artistic opportunities, with the additional kinds of artistic pleasures and excesses and seductions, an art of spatial change where the action is sometimes the form. Thank you. Do you have questions?
So, is this a kind of proposal for disinformation, manipulation, passive-aggressive urbanism? What are you really proposing here?
Well, your question was, is it a proposal for passive-aggressive urbanism?
Yeah, misdirection, sort of sneaking around, trying to take on the tactics and techniques of developers and high finance and all that. Is that a proposal, and how do you go about actually implementing it? How are you going to disrupt the system? And do you really think you can control the product, like what's going to happen once it gets kind of out there?
No, I don't think you can control the product once it gets out there. Our desire often as architects is to do just that, right? To make the master plan, to control the object, and that is an artistic pleasure and an artistic choice that's incredibly powerful and important. It's a lot of what we do. But I am saying that there's another aesthetic training, there's another artistic choice, which isn't about that control, but which is about sending in different kinds of things into this environment with intention, with deliberate intention, but without control, without. Well, the intent could be any number of things, not necessarily. It's not just to disrupt. I think I was trying to show through this sequence a number of sort of faders and toggles, a number of sort of simple tools, indicators of what could be active forms that work through those spaces, that stay in those spaces, that unfold in those spaces. Extending the power of the kinds of forms we are more accustomed to making.
in your talk, if I understood you correctly, you spoke about the possibility of seeding, or the goal of seeding new forms of spatial organization that seem to be, in your talk, appropriate to the new kinds of software networked or globalized forms. And you prefaced that or proceeded with a lot of what ifs we could, and your only description of what a what if would be, if I caught it correctly, was a brief moment of debuilding with some degree of concentration with a small linkage to an economic development opportunity thereon. And then you moved into a discussion of a counter politics or counter spaces to the structures of power, as I understood it, and you started with a description of a potentiality of speaking the divergence between the what is said of the power, development power, against what in fact is done, which struck me as being very close to an old immanent critique. But then your political, if I understood again correctly, actions was through the gossip mills, the panda gifts, taking the same structures of how power, how information as ideological content of the present, in its form that is exactly how the structures of power, it seems to me, actually do operate now in their kind of delusion machines. And I wonder if you could extrapolate about how, what it sounded like, mimicking the very means of illusion and delusion and the structures of the power itself as a way of destabilizing them in a politically unconscious and spatially new form. If I make that at all anyway a coherent question.
So your question is?
My question is, if you use the same forms of meaning and of action and of organization of power as it is organized now, how that feeds in, viralizes, and creates new forms that are outside of it, rather than reduplicating the structures and the forms that are dominant as they exist. And how is that talking the discrepancy between what is said and what is meant, what is not, I'm sorry, what is said and its discrepancy from what it really means, as you had said earlier.
Well, I guess I'm saying, when we look at a lot of the way the world's space is made, we see a lot of repeatable formulas and so on. And usually when we look at that and we look at sort of magnitude of the way it spreads around the world, we assume that there's not much that an architect could do to think about that. And I'm suggesting that there are ways that we know about that are much better than the people who are actually controlling that space, because we know about urbanity and we know about form and all the things that we're good at, that we can make things that enter those organizations almost like a germ or a virus that use the fact that those things multiply to be a carrier of other changes, to be a carrier of kind of contagious change. So does that make it a little clearer?
Yeah, that's what you said in your talk. That's understandable. I don't see how, I don't see the link.
Does it seem, oh, you mean you're saying that it seems like that's different, a little bit different from collusion, if that's clear.
Could I?
I haven't even saying it was just a person.
Yeah.
Or a collusive strategy. I'm trying to tease out, and maybe some degree of concretion, what that actually can be and how it can be done, other than reverting to the old notions of destabilizing by not speaking directly, but by speaking a cartoon to an otherwise serious power structure, which at this point isn't serious and isn't serious. It speaks in cartoons, it's very on its own at all.
I don't know if I answered your question. I'm sorry.
I wonder, Keller, and I wonder if I feel like we're all grappling with a way to kind of test your theory in a sense. And what I'd ask you is this, in terms of this the current project and your previous Enduring Innocence. It seems as though you're heightening a set of questions you asked there in terms of territoriality and piracy. And these extra trade zones, this extrastatecraft in a certain sense, appears to be in the constant over time and geographically at this point, is that these extra trade zones in a sense institutionalize the notion of, well, they institutionalize a sub rosa, like a super sub rosa macroeconomy for cities, so that precisely tax-free zones are now zones of are freely corruptible zones in a sense, that all the players in those zones know the games they need to play kind of off-board in order to get things done. And the public officials who sanction it have sorted out that what they lost in taxes, they gain back, and gain back with more control over revenue through these new arrangements. And maybe the world over it isn't so necessarily corrupt. But I guess my question is this, because it relates back to the kind of architectural object and what we can or can't do with it. I think some of our collective, I don't want to say indifference, and I don't think it is collusion in that shift, has to do with the fact that out of that system emerge some good clients. Out of that system emerge singular, powerful, and relatively undisciplined individuals who can sponsor some interesting one-off architecture. And we've grown kind of accustomed to those possibilities within the grander kind of matrix space that you describe. And in many respects, the matrix space seems to exist largely as kind of proof of standardized legitimacy against the one-off projects in, say, Kazakhstan. It seems glaringly so in autocratic regimes, but I would argue that in less regressive, obviously regressive places, you get the same dynamic. And to me, a lot of the museums we've built have been built out of the kind of singular cultural experiments of the Emirates, for example, seem to be the flip side of this. Would you agree, and do you think, if that is the case, is the role of the architectural object and our collective fascination with it less, I feel like you're trying to kind of sculpt out a realm for us to still operate as we,
operate with the architectural object, like get that good client. This is in no way a kind of, a critique of that. It's just it's more just sort of to say what else can you do? How else can you kind of slice up the problem in addition to that?
I think my point is that and I can think of a lot of good reasons for your reluctance to critique that dynamic in our field, but I think your project amounts to a powerful interrogation of that assumption at the very least. And let me leave you, pardon me, you're getting a lot of comments. Let me ask you a more particular question. How would, say, parametricism as a tendency in our field, or as a question, does parametricism make it easier for us to participate in the matrix space, or is it a kind of echo of it in our own world apart from it?
Parametricism, is a highly refined set of tools that we're very good at, and this is really valuing that, really valuing our ability to make those things and to think like that. It's trying to also extend the power of it, almost as if to say, if we can make these exquisite objects, how can we think about forms that are forms for handling those forms, that are forms that can engender a stream of objects like that. It's sort of a way of thinking about how those forms might be even more powerful in the world. They're already powerful. They're already politically powerful. I am often working with students on not only those kinds of things and that kind of object making, but other kinds of sites, other ways of slicing up the business of making space and the business of having spatial consequence. So sometimes the faders and toggles that we're working on are not themselves the object, but are a remote control to that object, or are as I said, just sort of protocol that puts two things in an interdependence, but ends up having spatial consequence, like the rule for Savannah that I was trying to get. So sometimes they're rule sets, sometimes they're details that are contagious within a population, but recondition a population over time, that kind of thing. Does that make any sense?
That does make sense.
Okay.
And I won't go on, but it was interesting to me in Savannah that the 4 blocks are first, second, third, and fourth tithing. And that it was actually a civic tax structure that drove the plan.
And the object was to prevent speculation, but he didn't do it by saying, I will make this plat for a town and I'll assign and no one can speculate. He did it by making a kind of growth protocol that retarded speculation. It couldn't control the way that the outline of the town would look. But it was incredibly specific. An architect should have been so proud to make that. He wasn't an architect, but we know a lot about space and urbanity. We could do with things like that, with that kind of power.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I think it's topically rare in this environment, so I think the discourse is helpful and certainly helpful to the community. I think what you're listening to is an effort on the part of people who are listening to obligate you in a way that you don't want to be obligated, as if the advocacy of disingenuousness gives you the conclusion that it gives you, which is you don't have to specify, for instance, how this would work in reverse, because I think the answer that you're giving is very non-specific. For instance, I think you present the world in a categorical way: good guys, excuse the euphemism, and bad guys. And that villainy and all of these examples of villainy, which are actually quite variable. In other words, the set pieces you use have very different kinds of buildings with very different kinds of meanings. They're not themselves homogeneous. And the tools that this surreptitious behavior, so this is not a new argument. It's in Sun Tzu makes, make the opponent fight on the low ground. Machiavelli makes the argument. But by the way, and you know this, to get it built, all the tool, if you like it, and it has some of the virtues that you're trumpeting, whatever is a substantial object. So we didn't really say. We said what it wasn't. We didn't say what it was. But the tools you need to get this stuff built are very often the tools that you need to get the other stuff built. It just depends in whose hands the tools are. So it's not as if the tools you're advocating are tools to make the world different or better. They're tools, they're on the table. And the people who pick them up and use them in a certain way probably depend on what you get. So it's not, these are the tools of the good guys and those are the tools of the bad guys. I'm not sure there's a difference. And anybody who's ever lied to a client or represented so-and-so when the answer is really such and such. The other thing is that I'm not sure this is as dominant just because numbers are there. And it was done in Almaty, or it was done in Shenzhen, or it was done in Singapore. Because numbers might make the opposite argument, that there's so much of it that it doesn't make any difference. It's a banality. And when it was rarer, I mean, if it were the Potsdamer plots or something 15, 20 years ago, but if everything is the Potsdamer plots, then maybe this is not such an intimidating adversary. And I think finally, that this is done actually provides an opportunity to counter it. So that if this is bad, in other words, unusual work probably takes place in the context of what it's working against or opposing or differentiating itself from. So to some extent, this is substantial and helpful ammunition, because in a way, the more junk there is, the easier it is to present something which is different or unusual or radical or takes a very different stance. So this is helpful in a tactical way. The junk makes it easier to do something which is contradictory to that. So I guess the point is you could use all of this, which you represent as a foil, as a positive. And the tools, again, the tools that you're advocating, I think, are available to anyone who wants to use the tools in the service of whatever they're supportive of. And some you may like, and some you may not.
There's not a binary in what I've been saying. There's not a good bad binary. There's not an object form active form binary. And I would stress that what I'm doing is asking a question.
But you don't like this. You're opposed to this.
I don't know.
Huh?
I don't know. I think there's power in this.
Are you opposed? Somebody says Obama's a Muslim. You opposed to that?
And it's not something to oppose. It's not
Sure
something
it
that
is.
it's something that what I was talking about when I was talking about that rumor was just how beautifully it's crafted. That it has nothing really to do with its content because it's easy to refute. It's more the way it behaves. What I'm interested in that is the way
Apparently
that
not. There are a lot of people
rumor
who accepted it over a long period of time. So you're either telling us that people are stupid, or that maybe the rumor in some contexts is plausible.
You understand that my lecture is asking a question. It's asking a question. It's sort of saying, look at the way in which there's so much change in the world, and it just so happens to be being made with space, architecture, urbanism. And I think it's perfectly reasonable choice to say that you're not interested in that. I think it's really a perfectly reasonable to make the choice that you just said, which is fine, let it run.
No, I'm not saying I'm not interested, but I can categorize it in a way that I think you seem to be equivocal about.
I'm asking a question. We're really good at the stone and the water. I'm asking a question. Is there anything we can do to the water? And what's the kind of form making one would have to begin to think about in order to do that?
Right. But why are we doing that?
What?
In other words, why are we doing that? If the stone in the water is inadequate, because there's a lot of water and there are only a few stones.
It's not inadequate. It's just it's
insufficient.
No, not even.
Needs more. Something.
Different.
More stones. Less water.
No, I'm saying what can we do to the water? Can we make the water? Can we influence that flow of sort of matrix space that's out there? Can we tinker with the wiring? Do we know how to get under the hood? Do we know how to work on the operating system? And it's an artistic choice. It's a question. It's also an approach rather than a set of prescriptions. It's suggestions about tools, about the kinds of tools we might want to think about. Is this going on too long? Should I?
I just wanted to say that to this conversation, it seemed in the beginning that you were suggesting that our intent and sort of where we are influences what we have begot, shall we say. And architecture has always been a function of power or money, or both, and a reflection of that. And I think one of the things that's very interesting today is you can look at China, who has a very different worldview and system of financing, and look at capitalism and its system, and then start to look at, well, are there other ways to look at the big picture, and will that influence this result? And therefore, we need to look for what is the result we're looking for at some point before we start to decide what road we're going to go down.
Well, I can tell you that at Yale, I teach a lot of those quants and McKinsey consultants who are deciding that the world will look like this. And they're actually very curious about space. They're very curious about space and urbanism. They're very curious about making space enter into global protocols that matter, that change things over time. And when I teach them, and they're so interested in it, I wonder if the architecture students just might be interested in it too, since we're supposed to know something about space. That's actually in many ways what's driving this is an attempt to answer their questions and translate between a lot of the ways in which space is being made and how our arts might be actually quite powerful, even more powerful than they sometimes are now. But I stress that it is in every way a question, a reach to that. Maybe we should, I don't know if we've gone on a bit too long.